Imagine risking your life every day, not for a country that enslaved you, but for the idea of freedom. He had no name in the newspapers, no statue, no textbook glory, but James Armistead Lafayette, a slave-turned-spy, may have single-handedly changed the course of the American Revolution. He infiltrated enemy camps. He gained the trust of British generals, and with every lie he told them, he brought America closer to victory. This is the story of the black double agent who outsmarted an empire, and you've likely never heard his name until now. Before he fooled the British generals, before he altered the outcome of a war. James Armistead was just a name without freedom. He wasn't born into fame or power. He was born into chains around 1748 in New Kent County, Virginia. A boy opened his eyes to a world where his skin determined his destiny. He was property, a line in someone's ledger. His name, James, was likely chosen by someone else. Armistead came from the slaveholding family that claimed him, but James wasn't ordinary. Even in silence, he watched, he listened, he learned. When whispers of revolution stirred the colonies, they cried for liberty, while owning men like James, as white men debated freedom from the British crown. James lived under the constant rule of a master. No vote, no voice, no rights, but the revolution brought chaos, and in chaos, opportunity. The American Revolution wasn't just a war between redcoats and rebels. It was a collision of ideals, a chance, however risky, to rewrite fate. Some enslaved men ran to the British, hoping for liberty in red uniforms. But James chose something different. He went to Lafayette, the young French general fighting for America. We don't know exactly how the conversation went, but imagine the courage it took. A man with nothing to offer but courage, asking to serve in a war that wasn't even for him. And Lafayette saw something in him, a sharp mind, a calm presence, a gift not for fighting with weapons, but with information. James didn't wear a uniform. He wasn't armed with muskets. He carried a far more dangerous weapon, the truth, and sometimes the lie. He would enter enemy camps, pretending to be what they expected, a runaway slave, obedient, harmless, invisible. The British, full of arrogance, never suspected. They shared their plans aloud. They drew maps in front of him. They trusted him with secrets that would help destroy them. James Armistead, the spy, was born. But at this moment, here in this chapter, he's still just a man in the shadows. An enslaved man volunteering for a cause that hasn't promised him freedom. Why? Why risk your life for a country that refuses to call you equal? Because James wasn't fighting for America as it was. He was fighting for the possibility of what it could become. A land where no one would live in chains. Not just the British ones, but the American ones too. Who was James Armistead? He was the man America didn't deserve, but desperately needed. The man whose name most of us never learned in school. Say it clearly. Yet, without him, Yorktown might never have fallen. Redcoats marched across colonies, and without Yorktown, there may have never been a United States. So remember his name. Say it clearly, James Armistead, because this is where his story truly begins. The war was escalating. Redcoats marched across colonies. Gunpowder thundered through towns. Smoke replaced silence, and in the distance, a revolution grew louder. But James Armistead still lived in the quiet shadows of someone else's property. To most, he was invisible, a servant, a slave, a name with no voice. But inside him, something was changing. He watched the rich men in wigs, yell about liberty. He watched them preach about tyranny and rights while tightening the chains around people like him. He wasn't blind, he wasn't naive. He saw the hypocrisy, but he also saw a crack in the system. And James knew one thing: when an empire trembles, the overlooked can become powerful. At this time, Marquis de Lafayette, the young French aristocrat turned revolutionary hero, was looking for more than just soldiers. He needed something far more dangerous: intelligence. British troops were gaining ground. They were slick, disciplined, and often outmaneuvered the ragtag Continental Army. But Lafayette knew something crucial. Wars aren't won by bullets alone. They're won by knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. James volunteered, not as a soldier, but as a man with a skill no one had trained him for: blending in, listening, understanding, disappearing. He approached Lafayette's camp and asked to serve. It wasn't a demand, it was a gamble. Because if his enslaver had said no, or if Lafayette had seen only a servant and not a strategist, James would have gone back to silence, or worse. But Lafayette was different. He was only 24, but wise beyond his years. He recognized potential in unexpected places. The general looked at James and didn't see a slave. He saw a weapon, a man who could walk between worlds, unnoticed. Lafayette didn't ask James to fight with a rifle. He gave him something far more dangerous: a cover story. James would pose as a runaway slave seeking protection with the British. A simple lie, believable because it was so common. Thousands had done the same, but this lie would become the key to America's greatest victory. Think about the courage that took. James wasn't sneaking behind tents. He was entering full enemy encampments, living among them, spending weeks gathering intel, listening to generals, memorizing maps. Every word he remembered could save American lives. Every mistake he made could cost him his own, and no one could save him. Not Lafayette, not Washington, not the Declaration of Independence. Because under the law, James was still not a citizen. He was still owned. But this was his battlefield. No bayonet, no cannon, just strategy, silence, and secrets. And in the coming months, James Armistead would rise from an invisible slave to the most valuable spy in the Revolutionary War. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't march in rank. He didn't fire a musket. And yet, James Armistead was one of the deadliest weapons in the American Revolution. He moved through enemy camps like a shadow unnoticed, unthreatening, entirely forgettable. And that made him dangerous. The British thought he was just another runaway, a man with no future, no education, no power. That was his cover end. It worked perfectly. To the British, James Armistead was useful. They let him fetch water, clean tents, serve meals, and in their arrogance, they spoke freely in front of him, delivering detailed accounts of troop movement, battle strategies, and vulnerabilities, not from guesses, but from the mouths of the British generals themselves. He listened, he remembered, and then he reported. He knew what to say, how to act, when to look away, and when to ask a quiet question. Night after night, he would slip away to Lafayette's network. He didn't just gather information, he began planting it. He learned everything through observation, instinct, and raw intelligence. He served directly under Lord Cornwallis, the British general who would later surrender at Yorktown. He didn't just play the role of a spy, he became it, and still, no one knew his name. And just when his value couldn't get any higher, James made a bold move. He became a double agent. the enslaved man who bent the war in America's favor without ever drawing a sword. He was a master of war without blood on his hands, and the greatest moment of his deception was just ahead. Feeding the British false reports, carefully crafted lies that made American forces seem scattered and weak. Information that led the British right into traps. He was just a loyal runaway slave, invisible and beneath suspicion. They never questioned how much he knew. They never realized they were handing him their own defeat, and the British believed him. Why wouldn't they? He had been in their camp for months. To Cornwallis, he was just another servant, loyal, silent, and seemingly simple. But in truth, James was Lafayette's most dangerous asset. James had mastered the art of deception. His very existence was a paradox. He was enslaved. Every plan, every map, he had no rights. But he controlled the battlefield with whispered lies. He discussed strategy freely in front of James, confident that a runaway couldn't understand, let alone betray him. There was no playbook for what he was doing. He wasn't trained in espionage. He earned the trust of men like Benedict Arnold, the infamous traitor turned British commander. And all the while, James was silently gathering the information that would bring them both down. His reports gave Lafayette and Washington something they desperately lacked: clarity. While other spies brought fragments, James brought the full picture. He knew where the British would be. He knew when they would move. He knew how to exploit their arrogance. He became irreplaceable. He was the ghost in the enemy's tent, the servant who shaped battles. He was now more than a spy. James had proven loyal. He'd been with them for months. Yorktown was coming, and James Armistead was about to make history. From the shadows. By the summer of 1781, the American Revolution was dragging into its sixth bloody year. British General Charles Cornwallis, battle-hardened and brutal, had turned his focus to Virginia, the rebel heartland, and there, hiding in plain sight, was a spy, a man with no rifle, no rank, but perhaps the most important weapon in the war: information. James Armistead, posing as a runaway slave, had slipped behind British lines. To the redcoats, he was invisible. Cornwallis sat in tented war rooms, plotting troop movements and supply lines. But James understood everything, every whisper. James memorized it all, then risked his life, sneaking back across enemy lines to Lafayette. And then the game changed. Lafayette realized something bold. If James could hear British plans, could he also plant lies in return? A new mission was born. James would become a double agent. He began feeding the British false intelligence that American forces were too scattered, that General Washington was stuck defending New York, that no French fleet was coming. Cornwallis believed him. Why wouldn't he? He was the perfect lie in human form. With this false confidence, Cornwallis made a critical decision. He dug in at Yorktown, a sleepy town by the Chesapeake Bay, ideal for British resupply by sea, but it was a trap. While Cornwallis fortified his position, convinced the Americans wouldn't strike, Washington and Lafayette were already on the march, quietly and quickly heading south. And out on the waters, French Admiral de Grasse's fleet sailed into the bay, cutting off British escape. Yorktown was about to become a cage. On land and sea, the British were surrounded. Artillery pounded from all sides. Escape was impossible. Cornwallis, shocked, asked, "How did they know our position? How did they get here so fast?" James Armistead's deception had worked. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. The United States had won its independence. But behind that victory was not just Washington or Lafayette. There was a man they called Invisible who had fooled an empire. James never fired a bullet. He didn't lead troops or ride a white horse, but his lies, his whispers, his courage to deceive the most powerful army in the world, won the war. There's a reason military historians call him one of the greatest spies in American history. There's a reason Yorktown is remembered as a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was a masterclass in espionage by a man born into chains who used his mind to break them. James Armistead Lafayette didn't just change a battle. He altered the fate of a nation. James Armistead Lafayette didn't carry a sword, wear a uniform, or stand tall in military paintings. But make no mistake, he was a warrior. A warrior with nothing but his mind, his courage, and a burning desire for something he'd never been allowed to have: freedom. He walked into enemy camps as a runaway slave, eyes down, voice low, face unreadable. They saw a servant. They saw property. What they didn't see was a man memorizing every map, every whisper, every glance exchanged between British officers. What they didn't see was a mind sharper than the generals he fooled. James didn't need to lie to be believed. He used truths the British expected. He leaned into their racism, into their arrogance. To them, a black man couldn't possibly be a threat. That ignorance became his camouflage. But living this double life came at a cost. Every moment spent inside British camps was a moment he could be discovered. One wrong step, one slip of the tongue, and he wouldn't be captured. He'd be hanged, slowly, publicly. So how did he keep going? Because James believed in something bigger than either army, bigger than even liberty, dignity. He was fighting not just for a nation's freedom, but for his right to be seen as fully human. Every message he carried, every deception he spun, was a strike against a system that tried to keep him invisible. Lafayette, the French general, didn't just use James as a tool. He recognized his brilliance. Their bond ran deeper than war. It was built on mutual respect, rare, powerful, and dangerous in a world that refused to see black intelligence as real. James Armistead was not a pawn. He was the king on the board. No one noticed until checkmate. And when the war ended, the generals went home to accolades and books and medals. James went back to being owned. Because while the revolution had ended, his personal war had just begun. The war was over. The British had surrendered at Yorktown. The drums of revolution had faded into echoes of victory. America was free, but James Armistead Lafayette was not. He returned to Virginia, not as a hero, but as a slave. While the generals received parades and speeches, James went back to the plantation, the same fields. He left when he risked his life for a country that still legally owned him. The injustice was staggering. He had deceived Cornwallis. He had delivered critical intelligence. He had helped secure the final victory. And yet, Virginia had promised freedom to enslaved men who fought as soldiers. But James was a spy, not a soldier, a technicality, a loophole that kept him in chains. The man who helped birth a nation found himself denied the very freedom he fought to create. But not everyone forgot him. Marquis de Lafayette, the French commander who worked closely with James, was furious. He penned a personal letter to the Virginia General Assembly, a passionate plea, reminding them that James had rendered essential services and that his deception directly contributed to American victory. Lafayette called him a faithful servant of liberty. He called him a patriot. But even with Lafayette's backing, James had to wait. 4 long years passed before the legislature finally approved his emancipation in 1787. 4 years of waiting. 4 years of being called property in the land he helped liberate. When he finally received his manumission papers, he made a powerful choice. He added a new name, Lafayette, not as a mark of ownership, but as a symbol of brotherhood, gratitude, freedom. James Armistead Lafayette was no longer a number in someone's ledger. He was a free man. But the question lingers like smoke over the battlefield. How many heroes went unrecognized? How many patriots remained enslaved? James got his freedom, but he had to fight for it twice. Once against the British, and once against the very country he saved. The war had ended. The British had surrendered. The United States was born. But for James Armistead Lafayette, the man who had risked everything to help win that war, freedom was still out of reach. He returned to Virginia not as a hero, but as property, still enslaved, still bound by law. His brilliant espionage work hadn't earned him liberty, because he hadn't been enlisted as a soldier. He was classified as a volunteer, and in the eyes of Virginia law, that meant he had no claim to emancipation. It was a cruel irony. The man who had helped birth a nation based on freedom remained in chains. But James was not forgotten by one man, Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who had come to love James, not just as an asset, but as an equal, took action. He wrote a passionate letter to the Virginia legislature, personally vouching for James's contributions during the war. Lafayette didn't just sign his name. He put his honor, his rank, and his reputation on the line for a black man enslaved in America, and it worked. In 1787, 6 years after his first spy mission, James Armistead was finally granted his freedom. In gratitude, he adopted the name James Armistead Lafayette, not out of servitude, but out of respect. It was a powerful statement. He may have been born a slave, but he would die a free man, with the name of the man who fought for his liberty. Now free, James purchased land near New Kent County, Virginia. He became a farmer, raising livestock, tending crops, and starting a family. He lived a quiet, self-sufficient life. No medals, no headlines, no fame. But those who knew him knew who he really was. In 1818, Congress awarded him a modest pension, a symbolic gesture, decades too late. But to James, perhaps freedom itself was the only reward that mattered. And yet, his legacy didn't echo in classrooms. No grand monument was built, no holiday declared. For generations, his name faded into footnotes. But James Armistead Lafayette's contribution is etched in the very soil of this country. Without his lies, there might never have been a truth called America. He reminds us that sometimes the most powerful patriots are the ones history tries hardest to forget. But heroes like James don't vanish. They wait in the shadows of time for a moment like this to finally be remembered. History is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And for over 2 centuries, America chose to forget James Armistead Lafayette. In textbooks, he was a footnote, if mentioned at all. A man who helped win the war, erased by the very freedom he helped secure. While generals became legends and slaveholders became founding fathers, the enslaved man who outwitted the British Empire was left in silence. Why? because his story didn't fit the clean version of American history we were taught. A version where liberty rang out clearly, without contradiction. Where heroes looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, and fit neatly on currency and statues. James Armistead's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that America's freedom was built not just by speeches and muskets, but by spies who weren't even free themselves. It asks, how do you fight for liberty when you don't yet have your own? For too long, history sanitized the revolution. It made it noble, simple, heroic. But the real story was messier, darker, and more human. It was full of people like James, men and women who risked everything for a freedom they were denied, and those stories were left behind. The rewriting of forgotten history isn't about guilt. It's about truth. It's about giving credit where it's long overdue. It's about teaching our children that heroes come in every shade, from every background. And it's about admitting that a nation born in revolution must constantly re-examine who we honor and who we've ignored. James Armistead Lafayette is not a side character in America's founding. He's proof that the fight for freedom has never been limited to speeches and signatures. Sometimes it's whispered between tents. Sometimes it rides in the minds of men no one expected to change the world. And sometimes it wears the name of the very man who helped you win. It's time to write James back into history, not as a footnote, but as a founding story. 200 years have passed since James Armistead Lafayette risked everything for a freedom he didn't yet have. And for far too long, his name remained buried beneath the myths of marble statues and powdered wig patriots. But history has a funny way of resurfacing, especially when the truth refuses to stay hidden. Today, his story is finally starting to rise. Not because it was handed down by textbooks, but because people, everyday people, are asking, who else helped shape America but never got the credit? In classrooms across the country, students are learning his name for the first time. In museums and documentaries, his legacy is no longer a footnote. He's becoming what he always was, a hero, a patriot, and a symbol of the unwritten chapters in American history. His face may not be on a dollar bill. His name may not echo like Washington or Jefferson. But James Armistead Lafayette did something even more powerful. He exposed a truth, not just to the British, but to us, that a man born in chains could still fight for freedom. That the most powerful weapon in a revolution wasn't a gun, it was information. And that even when a system denies you everything, you can still outsmart an empire. Today, his story speaks louder than ever. In an age of surveillance, disinformation, and political deception, a black man with no rights, no wealth, and no title once used intelligence and courage to win a war. He reminds us that heroism isn't about who history chooses to remember. It's about who deserved to be remembered all along. And now, finally, James Armistead Lafayette is taking his rightful place, not just in history, but in the soul of the nation he helped create. He never wore a general's uniform. He never held a title. He wasn't promised freedom, and for years, he didn't even receive it. Yet, James Armistead Lafayette outsmarted one of the most powerful armies in the world. He was born into a system designed to erase him, silence him, and bury his story before it was ever told. But James did something that very few people, enslaved or free, ever dared. He took control of the truth. He infiltrated enemy lines, gained the trust of powerful British generals, and manipulated the flow of information with the precision of a master tactician. His every whisper rewrote the map of war. His every lie paved the road to victory at Yorktown. And when the smoke cleared, when the British laid down their arms, James returned, not to applause, not to medals, but to chains. That's the truth of America's founding. The contradictions, the injustices, and the unseen heroes buried beneath layers of mythology. But James didn't disappear. He fought again, this time for his freedom. And when he won that fight, he lived not as a spy, not as a slave, but as a free man who had already changed the course of history. His life is proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers behind enemy lines. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it wears the mask of obedience while tearing empires down from within. James Armistead Lafayette didn't just serve a cause. He embodied it: freedom, truth, resistance. He wasn't supposed to be a part of history, but because of him, history changed. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching history, you're reclaiming it. James Armistead Lafayette wasn't a general. He didn't lead armies or sign declarations. He worked in the shadows, risking everything for a freedom he wasn't even guaranteed. And yet, without him, the American Revolution might have ended very differently. His name isn't in every textbook, but now you know it. And now it's your turn to pass it on. Hit that like button if this story opened your eyes. Comment below. What do you think would have happened without James? Subscribe for more powerful, untold stories that deserve the spotlight. And ring the bell, because the next story might just be another piece of truth lost to time. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop digging for the truth.